Everett Thorne was checking his snares in the sodden woods behind his hovel. It was a useless task. He knew it was useless. The rain had been falling for a week, a miserable, bone-chilling drizzle that turned the world to mud and misery. Nothing moved in this weather, not rabbits, not squirrels, not hope. He knew the rules of his life, etched into him like the tally marks of his debt in Lord Critch's ledger. Rule 1. Keep your head down. The world didn't reward heroes, especially not poor ones. Rule 2. Never take what isn't yours. Not a fallen apple, not a stray glance, not a moment of another man's time. And especially Rule 3, the most important rule in the village of Oakhaven. Never, ever trust what comes from the Broken Fang Mountains. That meant wolves, that meant goblins, and most of all, that meant orcs. But when he found her, caught in a poacher's iron-toothed bear trap, half submerged in a bog of cold mud and her own dark blood, he broke the most important rule of all. She was an orc, a monster, and she was dying. And that choice, that single, stupid, compassionate choice, changed everything. The trap was old and rusted, but its jaws were buried deep in her thigh. Her skin, the color of moss and shadow, was slick with rain and blood. She was huge, a mountain of muscle and sinew even laid low. One of her tusks was shattered, the other a grim, yellowed point beside a lip split and bleeding. She wore scraps of leather and fur, nothing that spoke of a raiding party. She looked like a refugee, a desperate, defeated one. Everett's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. The rules screamed at him. Run, go back to the village, raise the alarm. An orc this close to Oakhaven was a death sentence, for it and for anyone who helped it. Lord Critch would have her head on a spike before sundown, and probably fine Everett for the trouble. He looked at her face. Her eyes were closed, but her breath came in ragged, pained rasps. She wasn't a monster. Not right now. Right now, she was just a creature in agony. The same agony he'd seen in a deer caught in a snare. The same terror. It was a language that didn't need words. He couldn't leave her. That was his fatal strength, his curse, his inability to walk away from suffering. It was why his larder was always empty. He'd give his last crust to a beggar with hungrier eyes than his own. It was why he was drowning in his father's debt. He couldn't bring himself to be as ruthless as the world demanded. His hands trembled as he knelt in the mud beside her. The cold seeped through the knees of his threadbare trousers, instantly. "It's all right," he whispered, the words absurd in the face of this giant wounded creature. I'm not gonna hurt you." Her eye, a startling, intelligent gold, snapped open. It fixed on him. There was no plea in it, only pain and a deep, bottomless weariness, and honor. He saw it somehow, the glint of a warrior's pride. Refusing to beg from a creature she had been taught was her enemy. Everett swallowed the lump of fear in his throat. He looked at the trap's mechanism. A simple spring release, but it was powerful. He was not a strong man. His arms were thin, his back stooped from years of hunger and labor that paid too little. He was a whisper of a man, a shadow. He put his hands on the iron jaws. He strained, his muscles screaming in protest. The metal didn't budge. He grunted, his face turning red with the effort. Mud and rain plastered his hair to his forehead. Nothing. The orc watched him, her breathing hitched. He saw a flicker of something in her golden eye. Not pity, not contempt, maybe surprise. "Need a lever," Everett muttered to himself, his own breath coming in clouds of white. He looked around, his eyes scanning the forest floor. A fallen branch, thick as his arm, lay half buried in the leaf litter. It was rotten, but it would have to do. He dragged it over, wedging one end under the trap's spring. He put all his meager weight on the other end. The wood groaned, spraying damp splinters. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a pained screech of metal on metal, the jaws of the trap shuddered. They began to open, just a fraction. A low groan escaped the orc's lips. a sound of pure agony as the pressure shifted on her mangled leg. Everett pushed harder, his vision starting to swim. The wood was cracking. It was going to break. Almost, he gasped, putting his foot on the branch to add his full weight. Almost there. With a final sharp crack, the branch snapped, but not before the jaws opened wide enough. The orc, with a surge of desperate strength, tore her leg free. The sound was wet and sickening. She collapsed back into the mud, panting, her eyes screwed shut against the fresh wave of pain. Everett fell backwards, landing hard in the muck. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, the broken branch in his hand. He had done it. He had freed her. Now what? The rules were still screaming. Leave her. You freed her. Your duty is done. She's not your problem. But he looked at the gash in her leg. It was deep. She wouldn't get far. She would die of blood loss or infection within a day. Alone, in the cold mud. He thought of his hovel, a single room with a leaking roof and a hearth that was perpetually cold. He had half a loaf of stale bread and a handful of dried herbs. It wasn't a home. It was a place to slowly die. But it was dry. It was shelter. He stood up, his body aching. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice quiet. The orc, Gaza, though he did not know her name, pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her massive form trembled with effort and pain. She looked from him to her leg, then back to him. She didn't speak. He wasn't even sure if she could speak his language. But the look in her eyes was clear enough. No, an alliance of desperation was forged in that silent moment. He was weak, but he could walk. She was strong, but she was crippled. Together, they were less pathetic. Barely. "Here," he said, moving to her side. He braced himself, offering his shoulder. It was like trying to prop up a fallen oak. "Lean on me." She hesitated, her pride warring with her pain. He could see it. The deep-seated distrust. The instinct to refuse help from the small, soft creature. But her body betrayed her. With a shuddering sigh that seemed to drain the last of her strength, she wrapped one huge green-skinned arm around his shoulders. Her weight was immense. Everett's knees buckled. He staggered, finding his footing in the slick mud. Her arm was like a band of iron, the muscle dense and powerful even in her weakened state. She smelled of blood, rain, and a wild, earthy scent like pine needles and damp soil. They began the slow, agonizing journey back to his hovel. Every step was a trial. He grunted with the strain. She grunted with the pain. They were a clumsy, broken pair, a human scarecrow and a wounded giant, lurching through the grey, weeping woods. The world was against them. The rules were against them. But for now, they were against the world together. It took them an hour to cover a distance he usually walked in 10 minutes. By the time the sad, slumped shape of his hovel came into view, with its perpetually smoking chimney and moss-eaten thatch, Everett felt like his spine was going to snap. He pushed open the ill-fitting door, which scraped a protest against the warped floorboards. The inside was no better than the outside. A single room, cloaked in shadow and the smell of dampness and poverty. A rickety table, one chair, a straw pallet in the corner that served as his bed. The air was cold. Gaza practically fell through the doorway, collapsing onto the dirt floor with a thud that shook the whole flimsy structure. She lay there, panting, her good leg drawn up, the wounded one stretched out before her, a ruin of flesh and leather. Everett leaned against the doorframe, his own legs trembling with exhaustion. He looked at her, this impossible, dangerous secret lying in the middle of his floor. The sheer scale of her filled the tiny room. She was a mountain crammed into a molehill. He closed the door, shutting out the grey world. The gloom inside deepened. For a long moment, the only sounds were their shared, ragged breathing and the relentless drumming of rain on the roof. One drop, then another, found its way through the thatch, and landed with a soft plink in a pot he kept on the floor for that exact purpose. He had brought the monster home. He had broken the rule. He moved to the hearth and used the last of his kindling to coax a small, sullen fire to life. The flames were weak, but they pushed back the worst of the shadows, casting flickering orange light on the orc's exhausted face. Her skin was a complex landscape of old scars and new pain. He took his last half loaf of bread from a small wooden box. It was hard as a rock. He broke it in two, the crack loud in the silence. He walked over and placed one half on the floor beside her. She stared at the bread. Then she looked up at him. Her golden eyes seemed to bore into him, searching for the trick, the trap. Orcs and men had been killing each other for centuries. Kindness was not a currency they traded in. Everett simply nodded toward the bread, then retreated to his side of the hearth and began to gnaw on his own piece. He didn't watch her. He gave her the dignity of privacy. He heard a rustle, then the soft sound of her chewing, slow and deliberate. They ate their meager meal in silence. Two outcasts, one by birth, the other by choice. The bread was tasteless, but in the sharing of it, something shifted. A fragile seed of trust, planted in the barren soil of their shared desperation. When they were done, he took the pot of collected rainwater and put it on the fire to heat. He rummaged in a small pouch, pulling out his meager collection of herbs. Yarrow to staunch the bleeding, willow bark for the pain, and a bit of moss he knew fought infection. It was folk medicine, peasant magic, all he had. He knelt beside her again. "I need to clean this," he said, pointing to her leg. "It will hurt." She gave a short, sharp nod. Her jaw was set. She was a warrior. She knew pain. He took a strip of cloth, torn from one of his own few shirts, and dipped it in the hot water. As he reached for her leg, she flinched, a low growl rumbling in her chest. It was pure instinct. "Easy," he said softly, holding his hand still. "I'm only trying to help." He moved slowly, telegraphing every motion. He gently began to clean the wound. It was worse than he'd thought. The teeth of the trap had torn through muscle and sinew, right down to the pale gleam of bone. He worked carefully, his touch as gentle as he could make it, washing away the mud and clotted blood. She did not make a sound, but her whole body was rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the dirt floor. A single tear, hot and silent, traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear of agony, not of sadness. He crushed the herbs and made a poultice, packing it into the wound. Then he took more strips of cloth and bound the leg as tightly as he dared. The work was clumsy, but it was the best he could do. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels, exhausted. The firelight danced on their faces. The small room was filled with the scent of herbs and blood. "Gaza," she said. The voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was the first word she had spoken. Everett looked up, surprised. "Gaza," he repeated. He pointed to himself. "Everett." She gave another small nod. "Gaza. Everett." They were no longer just orc and human. They were names. They were individuals. She was asleep within minutes, succumbing to an exhaustion so profound it was like a physical weight. Everett watched her for a while, this agent of chaos and change in his quiet, miserable life. He pulled his thin, threadbare blanket from his pallet and draped it over her massive shoulders. It was a laughably small gesture, like covering a boulder with a handkerchief. But it was all he had to give. He spent the night in the single rickety chair, watching the fire die down to embers. He listened to her breathing, listened to the rain on the roof, and wondered what madness had possessed him. He had invited the storm into his house. He could only wait for the lightning to strike. If you believe that kindness matters more than species, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps us share more stories about unlikely heroes. Now, back to Everett's decision, because things were about to get dangerous. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm, a routine of survival. Everett would venture out for food, checking his snares with a new sense of urgency. He foraged for roots and edible mushrooms, his eyes constantly scanning the woods, not for game, but for people, for the glance of a neighbor or the uniform of the village watch. Gaza remained inside the hovel, a prisoner of her injury and their secret. Her leg was healing, but slowly. The deep green of her skin was marred by the angry red of infection, a battle he fought with hot compresses and endless herbal poultices. She was a stoic patient, enduring his fumbling ministrations with a silence that was more profound than any complaint. During these long hours, a silent language developed between them. A shared glance when the pot on the fire finally bubbled, a nod of thanks when he brought her a cup of weak bitter tea. He learned the subtle shifts in her expression. The slight narrowing of her golden eyes meant the pain was bad. A twitch in her jaw meant she was growing restless. He talked to her sometimes, filling the silence with the small, mundane details of his life. He told her about the leaking roof, how it dripped in a different spot with every new storm. He told her about his father, the town blacksmith, a man whose hands were strong enough to shape iron, but not strong enough to hold onto his forge. He told her about the debt, the heavy, suffocating weight of it, passed down from father to son. He didn't know if she understood the words, but she listened. She would watch him, her gaze steady and unnervingly intelligent, as if she were absorbing the meaning through his tone, through the weariness in his posture. One afternoon, he came home with a single, scrawny rabbit from one of his snares. It was the most meat they had seen in a week. He was skinning it by the fire when he felt her eyes on him. "In my clan," she said, her voice still rough from disuse, "the hunter who makes the kill also makes the first cut of the meal." Everett paused, the small knife in his hand. "There is no clan here," he said quietly. "Just us." "There is honor," she countered, her voice firm. "Honor is not a place. It is a choice." He looked at the meager rabbit. He looked at her, the wounded warrior. He cut a piece of the meat and roasted it on a stick over the fire. When it was cooked, he offered it to her first. She took it, her large fingers surprisingly gentle, and gave a solemn nod. It was a small thing, a piece of meat, but it felt like a treaty being signed. As her leg grew stronger, her restlessness grew. She was a creature of action, of open skies and hard earth. The tiny dark hovel was a cage. She began to move around the small space, testing her leg, her powerful muscles bunching under her skin. One morning, Everett woke to a strange sound, a rhythmic thump, scrape, thump, scrape. He sat up on his straw pallet. Gaza was awake. She had taken his small wood axe and was using the blunt end to tamp down the dirt floor, making it level and hard. It was a small improvement, but it was work. It was purpose. From there, she found other things to do. She saw him struggling to mend a broken tool. She took it from him and, with her immense strength, bent the warped metal back into shape with her bare hands. He watched, astonished. The biggest problem was the roof. The leak had become a steady trickle, the plink, plink, plink into the pot, a constant, maddening reminder of his poverty. He had no money for new thatch, no skill to fix it himself. Gaza looked at the dripping ceiling, then at him. "This is no way to live," she stated. It wasn't a judgment. It was a fact. The next day, while he was out foraging, she did the unthinkable. She left the hovel. When Everett returned, his heart pounding with fear at the sight of the open door, he found her dragging a massive fallen log toward the hovel. A log so big it would have taken 3 men from the village to move. She was dragging it with one arm, her injured leg taking the strain, her face a mask of grim determination. "What are you doing?" he hissed, rushing to her side. "Someone will see you." "The roof is broken," she said, as if it were the simplest explanation in the world. I will fix it. Over the next 2 days, they worked together. She, with her brute strength, did the heavy lifting. She tore off the rotten thatch, her powerful hands ripping it away like old paper. She used his axe to split the log she had dragged from the woods, hewing rough planks with surprising skill. She hoisted them onto the roof, her muscles straining. He, with his smaller frame, did the detail work. He scrambled up the ladder he'd patched together, nailing the new planks into place with old rusty nails he had painstakingly straightened. He gathered fresh pine boughs and packed them between the planks, a temporary but effective seal against the rain. They worked in a strange, synchronized dance. Her power, his precision. They didn't need to speak. He knew when she needed a nail. She knew when he needed a plank lifted. For the first time in his life, Everett felt like he was building something, not just patching over decay. That night, a fresh storm rolled in. The wind howled and the rain lashed against their little house. But inside, it was quiet. The steady, maddening drip was gone. They sat by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside their dry, secure shelter. "It is good," Gaza said, looking up at the solid new roof. "Yes," Everett replied, a small, unfamiliar feeling swelling in his chest. It felt like pride. "It is." In that moment, the hovel felt less like a prison and more like a home. The bond between them, forged in pain and desperation, was now being reinforced with shared work and mutual respect. He was no longer just her rescuer, and she was no longer just his patient. They were partners, a family of two, against the world. But the world has a way of finding you. The discovery came, as it often does, through the eyes of a child. A young boy named Finn, chasing a runaway chicken, ventured farther into the woods behind the village than he was supposed to. He saw her. He was hiding behind an old oak, peering toward Everett's hovel, when Gaza emerged for a moment to stretch in the sliver of sunlight. Finn saw a giant, green-skinned creature with a tusk, a monster from the stories his grandmother told him to make him behave. He didn't scream. He was too terrified to scream. He just backed away, his eyes wide, and then he turned and ran. He ran all the way back to the village square, his lungs burning. The word spread like fire in dry grass. Orc. The word was a poison, a panic. It jumped from person to person. At the tavern, at the market, at the smithy, an orc in the woods, near Old Man Thorne's place. Prejudice was a wall that had stood for generations, built brick by brick from fear and bloodshed. The villagers didn't see a person. They saw a raid. They saw burning homes and stolen children. They saw the monster from their nightmares. By midday, a small, angry crowd had gathered at the edge of the woods, armed with pitchforks and hunting knives. They were led by the town blacksmith, a burly man named Borin, who saw himself as the village protector. Everett was inside, mending a tear in his cloak, when he heard the shouting. He looked at Gaza. Her hand was resting on the handle of the wood axe. Her face was calm, but her golden eye burned with a familiar, dangerous light. The warrior was awake again. "Stay here," he said, his voice tight. "Don't let them see you." He stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind him. He walked toward the crowd, his hands held up in a placating gesture. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. "Borin," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What is all this?" "Don't play dumb with us, Thorne," Borin snarled, his face red with anger. "The boy Finn saw it. An orc. You're harboring a monster." "It's a misunderstanding," Everett said, his mind racing. The boy was frightened. He saw a shadow, nothing more. "A shadow with tusks," someone from the crowd yelled. "A shadow as big as an ox?" The wall of prejudice was too high. He couldn't talk them down. Their fear was a living thing, twisting their faces into ugly masks. "Let us search your hovel," Borin demanded, taking a step forward. "If there's nothing there, you've got nothing to fear." Everett stood his ground. He was a frail barrier against their tide of hatred, but he was all Gaza had. "This is my home," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of iron. "You are not welcome here." The standoff was tense, the air thick with menace. Borin was bigger, stronger. The crowd was on his side. Everett knew he couldn't win a physical fight, but he didn't have to. A carriage, black and polished, rolled to a stop at the edge of the path. The horse was a fine, sleek animal, a stark contrast to the mud and poverty surrounding it. A footman in crisp livery hopped down and opened the door. Lord Howell Critch stepped out. He was a thin, pinched man, dressed in a fine wool coat that had never been touched by rain. He held a leather-bound ledger in his gloved hands as if it were a holy text. His eyes, small and cold, swept over the scene with disdain. "What is the meaning of this public disturbance?" he asked, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "You are disrupting the peace, and Borin, you are away from your forge. That is unproductive." The crowd shuffled, their anger momentarily forgotten in the face of a greater power. Lord Critch owned the village. He owned their homes, their debts, their lives. "My lord," Borin stammered, his bravado deflating, "we have reason to believe Thorn is hiding an orc, a danger to us all." Lord Critch's gaze fell upon Everett. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a cold, calculating assessment. He already knew. The whispers had reached him first. "An orc," Critch said, tapping his ledger. "A valuable asset, if it can be put to work, or a significant liability." He walked slowly toward Everett, his polished boots sinking slightly into the mud. He stopped a few feet away. "Everett Thorn," he said, his voice dropping, "I am not concerned with imaginary monsters. I am concerned with tangible debts." He opened the ledger. "It says here your father's debt, which is now your debt, is 3 years in arrears. The interest compounds daily. A significant sum." Everett's blood ran cold. He knew where this was going. "I have been lenient," Critch continued, a cruel little smile playing on his lips, "in deference to your family's long, though unprofitable, history in this village. But my patience has its limits, and harboring a fugitive creature of the wilds, that is a breach of your tenancy agreement." He snapped the ledger shut. The sound was like a judge's gavel. "I will overlook this orc situation," he said, his eyes glittering with malice. "For a price. You will pay your outstanding debt, in full, by the new moon." "The new moon," Everett whispered. That's in 3 days." 3 days, Critch confirmed, "or I will seize this pathetic hovel and the land it sits on. And as for the orc, I will hand it over to the village for judgment. I imagine they will be thorough." He turned his back on Everett, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "See that you are all more productive with your time," he said to the crowd, before climbing back into his carriage. The carriage rolled away, leaving behind a stunned silence. The threat of the orc was forgotten, replaced by the more immediate and terrifying threat of Lord Critch. The crowd dispersed, muttering amongst themselves. The show was over. Everett stood alone, the weight of the impossible demand crushing him. 3 days. It was a death sentence. He couldn't earn that much money in 3 years, let alone 3 days. He turned and went back inside. Garza was standing by the hearth, the axe still in her hand. She had heard everything. "I will leave," she said, her voice a low rumble. "I will not bring this trouble on you." "No," Everett said, the word coming out with more force than he expected. He looked at her, at the dry roof she had helped him build, at the space that had become a home. "No, you won't. This isn't your fault. It's his." He sank into the chair, his head in his hands. The dampness of poverty, the mold of despair, was creeping back in, chilling him to the bone. He felt the rusty iron key in his pocket. A key to a life he had lost. Now he was about to lose the little he had left. Garza walked over to him. She stood there for a moment, a silent, brooding mountain. Then she did something that surprised him more than anything else had. She reached out one huge scarred hand and placed it gently on his shoulder. Her touch was heavy, solid. It was not a touch of pity. It was a touch of solidarity. "We are not broken yet," she said. And looking into her fierce, loyal, golden eye, Everett, for the first time, believed it. They were a family, and you don't abandon family. Can you believe they did that? If you're rooting for this strange family to survive, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Comment below. Would you have opened your door? But hold on, because Lord Critch wasn't finished yet, and another far more dangerous enemy was on his way. The next 2 days passed in a haze of quiet dread. The deadline loomed over them, a storm cloud on the horizon, black and heavy with ruin. Everett felt a familiar, hollow ache in his gut. It was the ache of helplessness. He went through the motions of his life, checking the empty snares, gathering the sparse winter roots. But his mind was a maelstrom. There was no way out, no miracle waiting in the woods. Gaza was a coiled spring of tension. She watched him, her gaze heavy with a warrior's frustration. She was a creature of action, and this slow creeping doom was a torture to her. She paced the small hovel, her heavy footsteps a rhythm of caged power. Her leg was almost fully healed, her limp barely noticeable. She was ready for a fight, but their enemy was a number in a ledger, a debt. How do you fight a debt with an axe? "There must be something of value," she said on the second night, her voice rough with impatience. She scanned the pitiful contents of the hovel. "A hidden coin, a silver cup. Your people value these things." Everett gave a short, bitter laugh. He pulled the rusty iron key from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a dull clink. "This is my only inheritance," he said. "A key to a door I can no longer open. My father's smithy, lost to the same debt that now comes for me." Gaza picked up the key. It looked small and fragile in her massive hand. She studied it, her brow furrowed. "A key is a promise," she murmured, more to herself than to him. A promise of a place to return to. She closed her fist around it. "This is not nothing." He didn't have the heart to tell her that it was. On the third day, the day of the new moon, a different kind of fear arrived in Oakhaven. It came not in a polished carriage, but on the back of the wind. A rumor carried by a breathless trapper who had stumbled out of the Broken Fang Mountains. He spoke of a warband, orcs, but not like any seen before. They were disciplined, armored in black iron, and they moved with a chilling purpose. They were not raiding, they were hunting. Their leader, a brute of terrifying size with a helm made from a dire wolf's skull, was asking questions. He was looking for someone. A fugitive, a female orc. The news spread through Oakhaven even faster than the rumor of Gaza's presence had. This was a tangible threat. A warlord at their doorstep. Borin the blacksmith began organizing a militia, his earlier bravado now tinged with real fear. The wall of prejudice that had been a weapon against Everett was now a shield they cowered behind. When Everett heard the news from a passing neighbor who shouted it at his door, he felt a dread colder than any debt. He looked at Gaza. Her face was a mask of stone, but her golden eye held a flicker of something he had not seen before. A deep, personal fear. "Thrathrak," she breathed, the name like a curse. "He found me." "Who is he?" Everett asked, his voice low. "My former general," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "He led the coup. He believes in power through bloodshed, in the old ways. He thinks my desire for peace is a weakness. He hunted down my loyal guard, one by one. I am the last." She looked at him, her expression grim. "He will not stop until I am dead. He cannot allow my claim to the throne to exist." Throne. The word hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Everett stared at her. The wounded refugee, the fixer of his roof, the silent partner in his poverty. A queen. The prompt from the universe suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. He had been sheltering royalty. Before he could process the revelation, the sound of a heavy tread outside ripped them from the moment, not the shuffling feet of villagers. This was the confident, heavy tramp of armored boots. The door to the hovel was not kicked in. It was torn from its hinges and tossed aside as if it were kindling. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the grey afternoon light, was a figure of pure menace. He was even larger than Gaza, his body a monument of scarred muscle encased in jagged black iron. A helm fashioned from a massive wolf's skull obscured his face, its empty eye sockets seeming to glitter with malice. In his hand, he held a war axe that looked capable of splitting an oak tree in a single blow. This was Thrathrak's skull render. Behind him stood a dozen more orcs, their faces grim, their weapons ready. "Gaza!" Thrathrak's voice boomed, a gravelly sound amplified by the helm. "You have led me on a long chase, hiding in the filth of men. It is a pathetic end for a queen." Gaza moved to stand in front of Everett, shielding him with her body. She grabbed the small wood axe from the hearth. It looked like a child's toy compared to Thrathrak's weapon. "This is not your land, Thrathrak," she said, her voice ringing with an authority Everett had never heard before. "You have no power here." Thrathrak let out a harsh laugh. "Power is where I take it, and I am taking you, dead or alive. The blood clans demand a strong leader, not a sentimental fool who bargains for peace with lesser creatures." He took a step into the hovel, his presence sucking the very air from the room. But before he could take another, a new voice cut through the tension, a clipped, annoyed voice. "What is this monstrosity?" Lord Howell Critch stood just behind the line of orcs, his footman cowering beside him. He had come to collect his debt. He looked at the assembled warband with the same disdain he looked at everything else, his annoyance at the interruption overriding any sense of fear. "This is a private matter of property seizure," Critch announced, stepping forward imperiously. "This land and everything on it is forfeit to me. That includes," he added, eyeing Gaza, "any livestock." Thrathrak turned his helmeted head slowly to look at the small, arrogant human. He was so taken aback by the man's audacity that he was momentarily speechless. This was the moment, the crisis, the convergence of threats. Everett's two nightmares, the warlord and the landlord, had met on his doorstep, and in that moment of shocked silence, something inside Everett Thorne snapped. The weariness, the fear, the helplessness, it all burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated iron will. He had nothing left to lose, nothing but her. He stepped out from behind Gaza. The sight was absurd. The frail, threadbare human standing between the monstrous orc warlord and the imperious human lord, a lamb trying to mediate between two wolves. "Enough," Everett said. His voice didn't tremble. It was quiet, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a bell. Both Critch and Thrathrak looked at him. "You," Everett said, his gaze fixed on Lord Critch. "You want your debt." He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the last of his worldly possessions. Not the key, the coins. 7 small, worn copper coins, not even enough to buy a full loaf of bread. He walked forward and threw them at Critch's feet. They landed in the mud with a pathetic little spatter. "There," Everett said. "That is my payment. It is all I have. It is for her." He pointed a trembling finger at Gaza. "You want to put a value on a life? That is her value to you. 7 coppers. Now take it and leave her be." Critch stared at the coins, his face a mask of insulted fury. "Is this a joke? That is nothing." "It is everything I have," Everett repeated, his voice raw. "And it is more than you deserve." Then he turned to Thrathrak. The wolf helm seemed to stare right through him. Everett did not flinch. "And you," he said, his voice ringing with a moral authority he didn't know he possessed. You speak of strength and honor, but you hunt a wounded woman who showed you mercy once. You bring a war band to threaten a single person. You call her weak for seeking peace. Look at you. You are the weak one. You are a coward, hiding behind armor and titles because you are terrified of a future you cannot control. A dead silence fell over the clearing. The villagers, who had crept closer to watch, were stunned. The orc warriors shifted uncomfortably. No one had ever spoken to Thrathrak like that, and lived. Thrathrak's knuckles whitened on the haft of his axe. A low growl emanated from behind his helm. "You are a brave little insect," he snarled. "I will enjoy crushing you." He raised his axe, but before it could fall, Gaza stepped forward. She placed a hand on Everett's shoulder, a silent message of thanks. Then she looked at Thrathrak, and the queen that had been hidden for so long finally emerged. "He is right, Thrathrak," she said, her voice resonating with power. It was the voice of command, the voice of a ruler. "You have forgotten the meaning of honor." She reached up and unclasped a small, tarnished metal amulet from beneath her leather tunic. It was dull and unremarkable, but as she held it up, it seemed to catch the light. On it was etched a sigil, a mountain crowned by a single, brilliant star. The moment Thrathrak's warriors saw it, they stiffened. Two of the oldest orcs in the warband dropped to one knee, their heads bowed. They recognized it, the star seal of the First Queen. The ultimate symbol of legitimate rule passed down for 1,000 years. It was a truth more powerful than any army. Thrathrak froze, his axe held high. He stared at the seal, then at the faces of his own men, their loyalty wavering, crumbling. "That is a relic," he spat. "It means nothing. Strength is the only law." "No," Gaza said, her voice like iron. "Honor is the law, and you have none." She turned her gaze to the kneeling warriors. "Korgath, Vrun, you served my father. You know the law. Is this the way of our people? To hunt our own? To bow to a usurper who breaks his oath?" The old orc, Korgath, looked up, his face a roadmap of scars and conflict. He looked at the seal, then at Thrathrak's brutal axe, then back at Gaza's steady, regal gaze. He slowly, deliberately, placed his own weapon on the ground. "No, my queen," he said, his voice rough. "It is not." The other orc, Vrun, did the same, and then another, and another. Like dominoes, Thrathrak's warband turned on him, laying down their arms not in surrender, but in a shift of allegiance. They were not his warriors anymore. They were hers. Thrathrak stood alone, his authority disintegrated. He was no longer a warlord. He was just a brute with a big axe and a broken oath. He looked around, betrayed and furious. His power vanished into thin air. But Gaza wasn't finished. She turned her gaze back to Lord Critch, who had been watching the entire exchange with a mixture of fear and avaricious confusion. "You," she said, her voice cold, "you demand payment for this man's home." She reached into a small, hidden pouch at her belt, one Everett had never seen before. She pulled out a single massive gemstone. It was uncut, but it glowed with an internal fire, a brilliant, deep blue. A king's tear, a stone worth more than the entire village of Oakhaven and all the lands around it. She threw it not at Critch's feet, but at Everett's. It landed softly in the mud beside the 7 worthless copper coins. "This is my payment," she declared, her voice ringing for all to hear. "For the debt of the man who saved my life, the man who offered me shelter when I had none, the man who valued my freedom at the price of everything he owned." She looked at Everett, and for the first time, he saw not a warrior, not a refugee, not even a queen. He saw Gaza, his friend, and in her golden eyes, he saw a reflection of his own hope. The crisis was over. The weak human had stood for the strong orc. The orc had revealed a truth that shattered armies and paid debts. And in the muddy clearing outside a broken-down hovel, a new world was being born. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Thrathrak, stripped of his followers and his authority, did not go quietly. He let out a roar of pure rage and charged not at Garza, but at Everett, the source of his humiliation. But he never reached him. Korgath and Varun, moving with the speed of loyal bodyguards, intercepted him. They did not kill him. Garza's first order as reclaimed queen was one of mercy, not vengeance. They disarmed him and bound him, his furious, impotent roars echoing through the woods as they dragged him away. His fate would be decided by orc law, not a bloody brawl in a human village. Lord Howell Critch, on the other hand, was defeated by something far more potent than force: avarice. He scrambled in the mud, his fine gloves ruined, for the king's tear. He held it up to the light, his eyes wide with disbelief and greed. The sheer value of it overwhelmed his senses. "The debt, it is paid," he stammered, clutching the gem to his chest as if it were a newborn child. He turned to Everett, his expression a bizarre mix of hatred and fawning respect. "The property is yours, free and clear. The Thorn Ledger is closed forever." He practically ran back to his carriage, shouting for his footman, desperate to get his newfound treasure to a secure place. He didn't even bother to pick up the 7 copper coins. They lay in the mud, glinting dully, a testament to a different kind of value. As the last of the drama faded, a strange quiet descended. The remaining orc warriors, now Garza's honor guard, stood waiting for her command. The villagers of Oakhaven, who had witnessed the entire spectacle, looked on with a mixture of awe, fear, and confusion. They had seen the monster from their stories reveal herself to be a queen. They had seen their poorest, weakest neighbor display a courage none of them had possessed. The walls of their prejudice had not fallen, but they had been profoundly cracked. Everett bent down and picked up the 7 copper coins, wiping the mud from them on his trousers. He then picked up the rusty iron key that had fallen from his pocket during the commotion. He looked at Garza, who was now surrounded by her warriors, looking every bit the ruler she was. She seemed a world away from the wounded creature he had found in the bog. She saw him looking. She dismissed her guards with a gesture and walked over to him, her limp now completely gone. They stood in the silence, the wreckage of his doorway gaping beside them. "Your home is broken because of me," she said, her voice softer now, the regal authority replaced by a personal warmth. "It's just a door," Everett said, managing a small smile. "We can fix it. We're good at fixing things." She smiled back, a rare, breathtaking sight that transformed her fierce face. The gap where her tusk was shattered seemed less like a wound and more like a mark of character. "Yes," she said, "we are." She had a kingdom to reclaim, a people to lead back towards peace. She knew it, and he knew it. But she did not leave that day, or the next. Her first act as queen was not to march north, but to stay, to honor the debt that truly mattered. Her warriors, disciplined and strong, made camp at the edge of the woods. They did not menace the village. Instead, they began to work. Under Garza's direction, they repaired Everett's hovel, not with rough planks, but with masterfully cut timber and new, tightly woven thatch. They rebuilt his door stronger than before. They dug him a proper well and built a small, sturdy shed for firewood. The villagers watched, bewildered. Borin the blacksmith, shamed by his cowardice and Everett's courage, was the first to approach. He came not with a pitchfork, but with a gift, a set of newly forged iron hinges for the new door and a small, sharp knife. "For the hunter," he'd grumbled, not quite meeting Everett's eye. It was an apology. Others followed. The baker's wife left a fresh loaf of bread on the doorstep. The farmer's boy, Finn, who had first raised the alarm, came and offered to help weed the small garden patch the orcs had cleared for Everett. He looked at Gaza with wide, curious eyes, no longer seeing a monster, but a wonder. A new community was forming, a fragile bridge being built between two worlds. It began at Everett's hovel, which was no longer a hovel, but a cottage. His larder, once perpetually empty, was now filled. The orcs taught him their ways of hunting and tracking, and he shared his knowledge of the local herbs and plants. They traded skills, then stories, then laughter. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Everett and Gaza sat outside the repaired house. A comfortable silence settled between them. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood and cooking stew. "You will have to leave soon," Everett said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she confirmed. "My people need me. We have a long road ahead to undo the damage Thrathrak has done." She looked at him, her golden eye soft in the twilight. "I want you to come with me." The offer hung in the air, shimmering with possibility. A new life, a place of honor in a queen's court, a world away from the poverty and prejudice of Oakhaven. Everett looked at his cottage, at the sturdy door, at the wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. He thought of the new, hesitant friendships he was forming in the village. He touched the rusty key in his pocket. It was a key to a past he had lost, but he was finally building a future. "Here, this is my home," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty. "You helped me find it again." Gaza understood. She did not press. She simply nodded, a deep respect in her eyes. "Then I will have a home to return to," she said. "A promise of a place to visit." She gently took the rusty key from his hand. "And I will hold this for you. A promise that a queen will not forget the man who bought her freedom for 7 copper coins." She would leave the next morning. But it was not an ending. It was a beginning. The house was fixed. The debt was gone. The warlord was exiled. But more than that, a seed of trust had been planted, and it was beginning to grow. The lesson was simple, but profound. Different doesn't mean enemy. Family is a choice, not blood. And sometimes the greatest strength is found in the quiet courage to be kind. And that is how a poor human and an orc queen proved that family is a choice, not blood. If this story touched your heart, please smash that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories about compassion overcoming fear. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even a rusty key can open a future. Thanks for watching.